Honourable the President.
Senator Simonette, you have 18 more minutes.
Much obliged, Madam President. Madam President, the avenues open for review, therefore, with regard to irregularities or complaints on the adequacy of a general election or the validity of the appointment of a candidate can be contained in two streams of redress open to the citizen and ventilated in the courts. The first stream, of course, is that made available by Section 52 of the Constitution and contained in the two sections we looked at before the break, that is in Section 35(3) and Section 149 of the Representation of the People's Act. The other stream, of course, is the common law stream, which is open to the challenger to question whether the election of anyone to the House of Representatives ought to be set aside as having been obtained so fundamentally outwith the Constitution and the law and principles relating to elections in a democratic society so as to render the impugned election effectively a non-election. And as Justice of Appeal Jamada opined in the recent case, an election that is not truly a constitutionally democratic and valid election. So that there can be no doubt, Madam President, that the arrangements existing under our Republican Constitution and under the common law provide well-tested avenues for seeking redress, which not only exist as available, but which have been tested by our Court of Appeal following several challenges in the form of election or representation petitions launched by aggrieved members of the public and indeed by aggrieved candidates. So that the maturity we have reflected upon exists not academically by reference to the studies and the reviews in less mature jurisdictions referred to by Senator Haynes, but by reference to what the lawyers call precedent that is binding upon us and that guides jurisprudentially how we manage ourselves as an independent nation. It bears saying as well, Madam President, that this is not a task that has been embarked upon a decade ago. The function and work of the Election and Boundaries Commission has been in existence for over 70 years. They celebrated their 70th anniversary in 2016. So I think it would be fair to say that the EBC in Trinidad and Tobago is enjoying in excess of that longevity given to man 70. And it is something that we ought, Madam President, to be proud of and to uphold and to recognize. Whilst fair criticism and vigilant review is always recommended and is always to be entertained in appropriate cases, I think it is important to underscore that those who have been responsible for administering free and fair elections in our Twin Islands state ought to be congratulated and given credit, as that credit certainly is due. My learned friend, Senator Mark, also indicated that in the setting of boundaries and delimitations of constituencies, there was some degree of deficiency. And indeed, the process was open to capricious conduct on the part of the EBC. In closing, I would like to point out that that cannot be a correct interpretation of the law, as the delineation and limitation of boundaries is regulated by the Constitution at Section 70. It's at Section 72(1) of the Constitution. In summary, the EBC is charged with the function of dividing the country into constituencies, and they are obligated to file their report on such matters every 2 to 5 years. That report is the subject of review by the House of Representatives. But more importantly, it must be, the work must be conducted in accordance with the second schedule of the Constitution. And that schedule governs the question of boundaries of constituencies. In essence, and I won't read the 7 provisions of that schedule, Madam President, but essentially it provides an overarching obligation to ensure fairness and to ensure that insofar as possible, constituencies are delimited so as to create a certain degree of equality and fairness in numbers and so on. In closing, I say that the solemnity of the right to vote and the regulation of general elections dating back to the 18th century make it absolutely correct that such matters be carefully regulated, and they are and have been for quite some time. It would be entirely wrong to assimilate the work of the EBC with that of other service commissions, who, again, under our Constitution, are structured to treat with the appointment and discipline of public officers, and who are mandated to implement government policy with equal skill and care. With such service commissions being interspersed to ensure and to protect public officers from direct political interference. Madam President, in closing, I say that the motion and the support for the motion by my friends on the other side falls short of the qualification for any intervention by either this or the other place in scrutinizing the work of the EBC, as the law adequately provides in its existence at the moment for proper redress to be had should the citizen have any complaint as to the manner in which free and fair elections are delivered by the work of the commissioners. So that I move that the motion be rejected and without further intervention, I would urge all those charged with the duty of ensuring our compliance with the rule of law to adopt same position. And I thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Senators, let us congratulate Senator Simonet on his maiden contribution. Senator Richards.
No thumping desk for me. Thank you, Madam President, for recognizing me and allowing me to participate in this motion as moved, this debate on the motion as moved by Senator Mark, which is it is established by Section 71(1) and 12 of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago that there be an Election and Boundaries Commission that, in the exercise of its functions, shall not be subject to the direction, and control of any other person or authority. And whereas the Election and Boundaries Commission is responsible for holding free and fair elections throughout Trinidad and Tobago, be it resolved that the Senate take note that the Elections and Boundaries Commission is not subject to any parliamentary scrutiny or accountability in respect to its activities and operations, unlike other similar independent bodies such as service commissions. And be it further resolved that the Senate call on the government to take urgent steps to introduce legislation that would make the Elections and Boundaries Commission accountable to the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago by allowing parliamentary scrutiny of its administration and the manner of the exercise of its powers, methods, and functionings, and any criteria adopted by the Commission in the exercise of its powers and functions. Madam President, through you, let me say that I agree with the principle of the motion as moved by President Mark. But as in any motion, one has to look at the wording very carefully. And I think the parts I may have some sort of issues with, if not the entire principle of the motion moved by Senator Mark, is the possibly issue of scrutiny as opposed to accountability and engagement. Because I don't see a mischief in more accountability, especially with a commission or a body or a function like the Elections and Boundaries Commission. in Trinidad and Tobago in terms of its critical and sacrosanct involvement in the elections of our country. But with that said, and that's because I don't see it as anathema to the fact that the Elections and Boundaries Commission, as has been outlined by many of the speakers before, has not had a good track record or an integritous track record. I don't see that having a different layer of accountability is going to take away from that track record or impugn in any way the reputation of the Elections and Boundaries Commission so far. But I would hasten to add and put on the record that while I agree in principle with the motion as moved by Senator Mark, I do not agree that this move be a mechanism for a witch hunt for any person, official in the Elections and Boundaries Commission, especially when and once that person has been appointed in an integritous manner and the person has shown no sign that they have run afoul of the law or is impartial. So I need to put that on the record, although I agree in principle with it. Because I think while there are parts of Senator Mark's submission and presentation that I agree with, there are some parts that I would like to distance myself from because it opens up what could be a Pandora's box of issues related to a person's conduct. And there was some also suggestion that one of the office holders is a relative of a government official. And if we look at it in Trinidad and Tobago, as I said, once the person has been appointed with integrity and following due process and according to the laws of the country, and the person is carrying out his or her function in an integritous and impartial manner, anybody in this country, anybody in this honorable hall could be accused of being related to somebody else or associated with somebody else in a small country like Trinidad and Tobago. So I don't see that as, quite frankly, a factor that will limit someone's eligibility. Madam President, I'm going to quote from a couple publications, and there are a couple issues I think I want to raise and hone in on in terms of, to me, the importance of possibly a GSC, more than likely, hopefully chaired by an independent senator, and going through a process of engagement with the EBC and the EBC officials to add a different level of engagement to deal with many of the issues that people who are charged with that responsibility, who are on the front line of administering free and fair elections in Trinidad and Tobago, will not be to the benefit of Trinidad and Tobago, especially in an evolving political landscape, an evolving global landscape in Trinidad and Tobago, where there's so many other issues coming into the election as significant factors moving forward. And quoting from the role of Parliament in promoting good governance from the Economic Commission for Africa, in the 21st century, there's a growing interest, more than ever, in the issues related to democracy. It's a reflection of the increasing acceptance that democracy and good governance is not a luxury, but a fundamental requirement to achieve sustainable development. Because without democracy, we've seen what can happen around the world. Also, because Parliament plays a crucial role in engaging, collating, and presenting the views and needs of the people, and articulating their expectations and aspirations in determining the national development agenda. As an oversight body, Parliament helps to identify problems and policy challenges and engage with stakeholders, agencies, and otherwise that require attention and assist in overcoming what may be, in some instances, bureaucratic inertia. And I like this quote very much. The existence of a parliament is not synonymous with democracy, but democracy cannot exist without a parliament, and the role of parliament in governance structures. And when you look at the word scrutiny, in some instances it may be construed in a kind of punitive manner. And that's why I prefer the word accountability, the words accountability and engagement. And what is the role of the EBC? And that's the question. And is it fulfilling its role as effectively as it could? And I think we can ask these questions without laying blame or impugning the character or function of the officials of the EBC, because these are relevant questions as the democracy evolves. Primarily to facilitate free and fair elections in Trinidad and Tobago, Who decides if the Commission is functioning effectively? Who decides if the mandate needs to change in our evolving democracy? Who decides if there are new options, arrangements, legislative opportunities available and applicable in it fulfilling its mandate? Is the Commission free from the possibility of political interference, no matter who is in power? Does the Commission have the resources to effectively fulfill its mandate? And I think as at the highest court in the land, I don't think it's anathema for the Parliament to have that type of direct engagement with the Elections and Boundaries Commission, not necessarily, as I said before, in a punitive manner or a condemnatory manner or a judgmental manner, but certainly from a manner in which we can flash out the issues with the persons who are on the front lines and possibly come up with suggestions and applications and legislative change for a more effective functioning Elections and Boundaries Commission and as a more fervent manner of securing our democracy. One of the quotes I also like is, real democracy is a mechanism for distribution of political power and ensuring that all voices are heard and considered to ensure the equitable distribution of access to state resources, tangible and intangible, including material wealth, decent work, healthcare, water, food, education, protection, opportunities, and justice. You know, and I think that's important when we're looking at the issue of the EBC and its ability to fulfill its role effectively. In a publication by Matthew Lawrence and Sarah Birch, focusing on the Democracy Commission, Reforming Democracy to Combat Political Inequity, August 2015, from the Institute for Policy Research, the UK's leading progressive think tank on democracy and governance. There are several issues that came up in terms of their examining their electoral commission in that jurisdiction. One is the issue of marginality. The other is the issue of inequalities in participation related to age, income, and class. And they've discovered in their research that in those jurisdictions, one found that those factors, those demographic factors, had significant impacts on persons' ability or willingness to vote. And that is not ensuring a level playing field. And their examination or engagement of their electoral commission was aimed at finding ways to engage those groups more effectively so that there was a more equal representation of what the people thought when they went to elections. Among the other issues that came up were fixed date for elections. Should there be mandatory votes in some jurisdictions over the age of 18? The issue of electronic or online voting, the issue which I think the Prime Minister, the Honourable Dr. Keith Rowley, spoke about some time ago, the issue of whether or not we should have a maximum of 2 terms for a Prime Minister. The issue of social media and its impact on the democratic process. And when we see what's happening around the world and suggestions right here in Trinidad and Tobago, that is an issue worth exploring in that kind of setting with the Elections and Boundaries Commission. Not again to be punitive, but certainly with people on the front who are on the front line of ensuring free and fair elections, to see what their experiences are on the ground with a view to giving them the resources or changing legislation to ensure that they can ensure that we have free and fair elections in any circumstance. The issue of referenda, which has been long discussed in Trinidad and Tobago, and whether those types of issues, whether or not we should decriminalize marijuana, whether or not that should be or could effectively be put when we go into the elections. The US does it very, very effectively, where in addition to electing congressmen or governors, they put these questions in their election process, because you're spending the money already, and you find out en masse what the population thinks. So I think these kinds of issues can equally be discussed in those kinds of fora, and not punitive, but certainly in a different kind of engagement. The issues of making voting more representative. There's an issue in Canada where there's a consideration of enacting a boundary commission as separate from the Elections Commission because of the issues they faced in the past. And also, one of the suggestions that I particularly like, because it speaks to a representative type of governance and making sure all voices are heard, is the issue of the single transferable vote system, the STV, which is really interesting and I think quite innovative. And it's a form of proportional representation which uses preferential voting in a multi-member constituency. And it's through you, Madam President, it's executed by candidates don't need a majority of votes to be elected, just a known quota or share of the votes determined by the size of the electorate and the number of positions to be filled. And where each voter gets one vote, which they can transfer from their first preference to their second preference. So if you preferred candidate A and he or she has no chance of being elected, well, you've put in on the ballot candidate B so that your vote for a candidate who may not have amassed a particular number of votes is not wasted. So you have more people getting a chance to choose who is eventually to represent them. And I particularly like that in terms of consideration. Canada is also, and Canada, as we know, is one of the more progressive democracies in terms of stability in the world. It's also considering significant changes to its system by engagement with its parliament and its electoral council. Ballot issues. Does the elector place a mark beside the single candidate's name, as we said before? The number of candidates per constituency in terms of limits, the procedure to determine winners, and the threshold for determining winners. And I kind of promised my colleague that I'm not going to be long. I know Senator West is going to possibly laugh at me because she always does. But one of the issues that it would be remiss of me not to mention in Trinidad and Tobago is the issue of course, campaign finance reform and the kind of engagement that we should have with the Elections and Boundaries Commission in the furtherance of that. And I'm quoting from the Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, 5th session of the 10th Parliament, and the first report of the Joint Select Committee appointed to propose a legislative framework to govern the financing of election campaigns. And when you think Senator Mark was part of that, Member of Parliament, Dr. Botiwari, Mrs. Camille Robinson-Regis, Mr. Clifton Decoto, Mr. Con Imber, Mr. Elton Prescott, Senior Councillor, Mr. Ganga Singh, Mr. Gavin Nicholas, Mrs. Helen Drayton, Ms. Marlene McDonald, Mr. Prakash Ramada, and Dr. Udal Munilal. Also, Gavin Nicholas was replaced by Anand Ram Logan, Senior Counsel, as a member of that. And the number of issues that came out of that could be, to me, further engaged at the level of a joint select committee engaging with the Elections and Boundaries Commission in Trinidad and Tobago to get those points to a different level in terms of engagement in Trinidad and Tobago. And many of the issues related were the law and definition of political parties, existing legal provisions governing spending limits, oversight of campaign finance and disclosure of finance. And the funny thing about that is in our constitution presently, under existing provisions, 18.3, there's a $50,000 limit for a general election. I laugh because it's actually hilarious. In the general election, it's as counteracted by section 47.2, which allows for a third-party contribution. And we all know that $50,000 per candidate is not spent in Trinidad and Tobago. Oversight, monitoring, and sanctions and appeal. I'm quoting from the Trinidad Guardian, Madam President, through you. Just to counter that suggestion, parties spent, this is Trinidad Guardian, May 20th, 2016, article by Richard Lord. Parties spent $157 million in ads for the last polls in the run-up to the elections in Trinidad and Tobago in 2015. This was revealed by President of the Advertising Agencies Association of TNT, Lauren Rosnat, during a session of a two-day conference on campaign finance reform at the Hyatt Regency in Port of Spain. Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley told the opening of the conference on that Wednesday, his government had the will to propose legislation to deal with the issue before the next general election. We're 2.5 years from that. And the issue and the importance of discussing issues like campaign finance to get it on the books in Trinidad and Tobago. I wait with bated breath to see if it will become a reality before the next elections. Interestingly enough, the article goes on to say that the UNC outspent the PNM 2.4 to 1, which didn't have a significant effect on the outcome of the election, or maybe it did. But I am just quoting Senator Mark. But my point, Senator Mark, is that although it may not have had the desired effect, if that indeed is true, we still have to look at the issue of campaign finance reform and its impact on the democratic process. Because in any democracy, we will know that we've seen it happen around the world where there's a suggestion that the expectation of the population that, well, and this is not pointed at any particular political party, that when you can raise 157 million, this is between the two main political parties, right? Nobody is thinking that those persons who would have invested in either political party is doing it out of goodwill. And I know we have the procurement legislation which will come into effect pretty soon, but we all know that they work hand in hand in terms of one, ensuring proper governance and preventing corruption. I'll close by, Madam President, that a High Court judge, this is a Trinidad Guardian article published on May 16th recently, 2018. A judge calls for proper framework for campaign finance reform. And, of course, the High Court judge, Justice Frank C. Prasad, said the courts, quote, in developing a democracy, we should help to decide whether sums of money received were spoils of campaign financing. And he said, we need to ensure that this veil of secrecy and anonymity must be removed, and there should be full disclosure of financial contributors with caps placed on the amounts. And I fully agree with that, Madam President, because at the end of the day, in the context of the motion being debated, and I know the EBC has presented reports related to suggestions for campaign finance reform and the impact it's possibly having on the democratic process in Trinidad and Tobago. How far has that gone in terms of real debate in Trinidad and Tobago? And I think the forum of a joint select committee or Parliament having the ability to engage the Elections and Boundaries Commission in that sort of context can go a long way in elucidating the issues, one, that the Elections and Boundaries officials would have faced, and two, their thoughts and the interrogation of the issue in its fullness, to ensure that we can have the urgency placed in it, one, and two, the resources that the Elections and Boundaries Commission may need to identify persons who seem to flout this law or who are flouting this law. Not seem to, because we know persons are flouting this law. We just haven't identified them and brought them to book yet. But I think those are some of the issues that kind of engagement is worthy of consideration with. So I don't see that parliamentary oversight or GSC, Madam President, engaging with or dealing with the accountability issues with the Elections and Boundaries Commission is anathema to or against the issue of or sending some kind of judgment against the function and past rule of the Elections and Boundaries Commission. So this is a motion, I guess, with a little revision or the addition of a word or two, I would have a tendency to support because of the importance that I know Trinidad and Tobago as a whole places on the function and role of the Elections and Boundaries Commission and the possibility of us getting some of these issues resolved moving forward. And I think in closing, I'll mention again the issue of the impact of social media, for instance, is one of the issues in our present books. We know of the laws related to canvassing on election day and putting up stuff, printing stuff in newspapers. I work in the media, so we have had to go through significant training of staff of what is expected of them on election day and election week, etc. And now with the paradigm of social media, I don't know that the Elections and Boundaries Commission has the resources to track and monitor online posts and influences and inferences on election day. And that is something we need to look at in Trinidad and Tobago. We haven't even considered the other issues related to that, as we've seen, is being investigated around the world. So once again, thank you for the opportunity to make this intervention, and I finish my contribution.
Senator Doughton.
You know, we temporary senators, Madam President, whenever we give him the chance, since we are not sure, there's no predictability about the next time. We have to take every opportunity.
That's what I should
So, yes, I heard that. Thank you for your goodwill. So I have 20 minutes. I've been assured, and I normally take 20 minutes. So it's my privilege to address this honorable House once more. 25, okay. We go right up to the borderline. Careful how we say borderline these days. I'm glad to speak to this because I believe as a pastor, I must always see hope for the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And I want to begin by saying there is nothing we cannot accomplish if we work together. And we may disagree from time to time, but certainly there's hope for our nation. And speaking about hope, because I want to tie my presentation to two concepts. One is hope, of course, and the impact on the body politic, on the human organism, all right, and the other is institutional trust. And where I'm going here, before I deal with my good friend, before I relate to some of what Senator Ramparat said, because we had a great experience in Mayara recently that I think is a model for the country. The issue of institutional trust. Whatever we could do to build institutional trust, we should be happy to do it. Whatever we could do, whether it's a line in our constitution, whether it's an oversight committee, whether it was mentioned by both Senator Roach and Senator Richards, in terms of oversight committee chaired by a JSC. And of course, I may tread on dangerous ground here, Dr. Mahabir, but we just have to be sure that, whoever chairs that committee operates independently too. Because you could have a challenge since none of us could boast that we possess papal infallibility. So therefore, we have to be ensured, all of us, on all three sides, but especially the independent side, that we operate with due transparency. So that I was thinking that during the debate, you had the kind of slight hemorrhaging of hypocrisy in the debate, in the sense that I went to vote some years ago, and at that time the voter padding allegation was all over the place. And there was a guy who was a financier, is a financier for a particular party, and he saw me in the line, not knowing that I was living in Diego Martin. And he came up to me, and he said, "Pastor, you are living in Diego Martin?" I said, "Yes, for the past umpteen years." He said, "I'm surprised." A lady called me and told me, "You know what he's accusing you of? Being part of the voter pardon process." Now, whether we like to hear it or not, both parties have been accused from time to time of interfering in the electoral process, either through voter pardon or gerrymandering the boundaries. And I was looking at something I didn't hear it mentioned before. I don't know if it flew past me, it was mentioned. But it was, I think, in the 1976 that we combined the Boundaries Commission and the Electoral Commission. That was in the year 1976, so they were separate up to and until that time. I am saying right now, I'm not here to cast aspersions on anyone. If it's one person shouldn't do that in the House right now, it's the pastor. Because that's, the good book says, judge not that it be not judged. And if I could just caution my dear friend, he's my dear friend, Dr. Wade, that we have to be careful not to go in that direction. However, to my mind, the motion possesses intrinsic value. If it's just to advance the transparency process by 0.5%, it possesses intrinsic value. If I should read it, be it further resolved that the Senate call upon government to take urgent steps to introduce legislation that would make the Elections and Boundaries Commission accountable to the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago by allowing parliamentary scrutiny of its administration and the manner of the exercise of its powers. So I am saying, to my mind, at this point in the history of Trinidad and Tobago, we need to build institutional trust. And if you build institutional trust, then you're going to create a greater level of hope in the society. It is not an attack on the present government, but people are losing hope. At faster speeds than Usain Bolt when he used to run. People are losing hope. And one reason for that loss of hope is the collapse of institutions. And what Michael Harris spoke about in his recent article about malignant narcissism and that kind of stuff. People are just losing hope. And one reason is that We have to do a lot of work with our young people. I feel we're not engaging young people enough in the process of governance, and like in the fight against crime, the fight against corruption, doing a kind of consistent, overwhelming education program where we show young people we are placing trust in them. I want to say that the issue of institutional trust must not be trivialized by any party who is in government, who is in opposition. Should not be. And I said last time I was here, what is amazing is that when you're in government, you look through a particular lens, and when you're in opposition, you want to have done what you didn't do while you were in government. And that revolving door is hurting us more than anything else, in terms of the governance of the country. That's a very serious thing. You know what I mean? When you have all the answers when you're on the other side. And I want to indicate to Senator Rambarat, we must stop asking the question sometimes. While it is good to ask the question, what you did when you were there, at the same time, that must not be an excuse for who is there now not to take particular action. That has to be said in a major way. So I mentioned before, there's nothing we cannot accomplish, if we don't work together. And I want to deal with that. I didn't know that the book, How Democracies Die, would figure in the debate. And they're two fantastic authors with funny names. So since I didn't bear them and bring them into this earth, I will pronounce them how I know best. It is Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky. Those two guys, and Senator Mark quoted them. Of course, throughout the book, there are a number of anecdotal experiences, etc. But some principles that he brings there that I think he deals with the concept of postmodern, post-democracy, or post-democracy, postmodern, the whole direction that we are going in. And he says you could identify, and I want to also agree with Senator Richards and a few other speakers, that not because we don't have a problem now, or didn't have a major problem before, all right, that we don't have to anticipate how to strengthen the democracy to face a challenge that could emerge in the future. In other words, democracy is not a frozen piece of ice or wood or a dead animal. It's a living, dynamic organism. And therefore, change, as Gandhi said, the only thing that is changeless is change. And I want to risk what he said. Of course, Thomas More is no good example of, freedom in terms of fundamental rights. But he made a remark, and I want to deal with it here. He says democracies die when elected politicians renounce their role as gatekeepers. That's when democracies die. And he gave, and Ziblatt and Levitsky speak to the issue, all right, of protecting the democracy and preserving it. And when you read that book and you read The Collapse of Democracy by Robert Morse, you see some intrinsic parallels, meandering through those two books. And the first one he mentioned is we have to watch out for tyranny in the future, although we enjoy a certain brand of democracy now. My honest opinion is that in some Caribbean countries, what we have in terms of Westminster brand of politics is really a prime ministerial dictatorship. That's what we have in most of the Caribbean islands. I was talking to Senator Ronald Huggins before we started Parliament. I was telling him, one of the greatest things we could do for democracy is remove the whip from both parties, which means people will be free to vote according to their conscience. Now, some people say that will lead to the destruction of the democracy, and you'll have elections perhaps every 2 years or every year. But I think if you have to risk, you must risk on the side of right, That is just perhaps my crazy idea. One thing that was mentioned in the book is refusal to recognize opponents as legitimate. That's why you have to strengthen institutions. And when you have a polarized society, especially around election time, I see a very interesting development. We have the emergence, of a mushrooming third party coming and some other parties. You know what I mean? Or a fourth party. I see that there. And I have heard a statement made by one of the members of the opposition in response to that development. But let me tell you something. Let me say this. We're all free to do what we wish to do to advance the cause. But I want to mention this, refusal to recognize opponents as legitimate. I have had to make this statement in church organizations, and I make it here. you mightn't agree to a point, but even the appearance of the listening and see value in the point could advance your democracy. All right? So refusal to recognize opponents as legitimate. Encouragement of violence. All right? Statements being made. Crazy statements being made at the platform or even in the parliament. All right? And then the third one is the attempt to restrict media liberty. Now, that's what you don't want to do at all. So that I'm saying that what we have to do here is strengthen democracy. If it's by a line, as Senator Richards, by a word, we have to get in terms of that. And if it could redound to the issue of building trust in our institutions, it's critical. I just want to spend about 3 minutes giving you an experience, Madam President, in the House here, of why we need to. A lot of people feel, you see this amount of murders taking place in the country, it's just like the criminals going crazy, and they don't respect anybody. And we have got to teach this House here, this Senate, must be the role model of respect and decency. No matter how aggressive we are, it must become a role model. It must be a role model of respect and dignity. I was engaged in a case recently, Madam President, and that is why I am a firm believer for the past 40 years in campaign finance reform. My problem with some of the bills, though, is that we want to address constitutional reform in a piecemeal manner. The time has come for us to overhaul the Constitution. We could see several lacunae in the constitutions. And I'm telling you, we need, and I favor proportional representation, to be honest with you. I feel in terms of the pluralistic nature of a society, in terms of religion and race and class, the only way forward to have general, national, development is to have proportional representation. And it will avoid us having to try and fix this piece of constitution here, this piece here, and this piece there. If we want Trinidad and Tobago to be the best, we must think beyond party affiliation, beyond class affiliation, religious affiliation, and political affiliation. If we want what is best for the society. And I know, I am not sure, I don't want to be judgmental here. I have not seen a political party, all right, that to my mind is aggressively interested, or major political party aggressively interested in proportional representation and campaign finance reform. To my mind, most politicians in this country feel that, especially in the present system we have, that will narrow their chances of winning an election. And by the way, what Senator Richards said is true. There is nobody investing heavy money in an election campaign wants nothing after. They want their contracts to be played, whether you cut it up in several bits and give this cousin and that cousin and whatever have you, or this friend. There is a synergy that operates there. Once you give that millions of dollars to, a nation of 1.3 million, over 150 million spending in election, the truth be told, people expect something. Then they're not, so altruistic that they give so much and expect nothing in return. And that is why the corruption bogey continues to haunt us. And I am saying, whatever could strengthen the democracy and give the citizens some hope that we're going to have institutions that function at a level of quintessential integrity could only help us to advance our democratic process and develop a brand that exists nowhere in the world and becomes a role model for the planet. So I am very serious about that. It has been said by C.S. Lewis. He made a very valid comment, and I want to repeat it about the value of everybody. You see, to value institutions and to value democracy and to value respect and to value true national development, we must value the individual. And C.S. Lewis made a remark. He says, and I want to quote him here, every human person matters. And hear what he says here? He's infinitely valuable, relentlessly unique, and endlessly interesting. And then C.S. Lewis went into the religious domain, and he said, every human being carries in himself the weight of glory. Hello, to solve the crime problem here in this country, to solve the corruption issue, to get a brand and a model of a political model that will relate to all the needs in this very plural society that is polarized, especially around election time. We need to strengthen our democratic institutions. And whatever could advance that cause, I will say will be a great thing. I just want to make 2 or 3 more points in this. I will just take about 5 minutes. I want to tell you at this time that we mustn't be a prisoner of legal definition. That is something I want to emphasize here and now. We must not be. And you know what this boils down to is the marginal seats, Madam President. The accusations that fly fast and furious deals with the issue of boundaries, when they are changed and how they are changed. And sometimes it's not that the Election and Boundaries Commission want to do a wrong thing, you know, or have an agenda for favor one party above the rest. I think the real issue is how it is done. Not what is done, but how it is done, and how we engage the population and how it is done. I don't know, we just get up one day and find that, you know, boundaries are changed, and you wonder who changed them. What was the catalyst driving the change? And hello, if we're talking about maturity in building a democratic model, all right, that even is more perfect or more reliable than the Westminster system we inherited, then communication with the population is exceptionally important. And I am saying people have concerns about that, and those concerns should be addressed. And we must find a mechanism. You know, I want to tell you this, folks, and I want the opposition not to feel a how. One of my disappointments of the last regime is that you had an excellent opportunity, like the regime before you, to fix the Constitution. I think what happened in terms of constitutional reform was an embarrassment. What happened in terms of constitutional reform was an embarrassment. And I am saying any party in opposition that wants to come to government must, that is something we must insist on, a mantra you must have, is that where you made mistakes before, you must come out and say, we made mistakes. We did it the wrong way, but you should do it the right way. And I think that will lend and, enhance and affirm political maturity. Madam President, before I sit, permit me to just say this. The Jamaican model is worth looking at. All right? The Jamaican model is worth looking at. What they have developed in terms of the Electoral Commission and the Electoral Office. To my mind, they have an accountability level that is important. No society could improve, all right, and emerge out of a crisis without maturity. All right, no society without honesty. And of course, the critical word here that I think Brother Mark has in his presentation, in his motion, is accountability. In other words, whether the opposition didn't do it, government, you have an excellent chance to do it. We live, we learn by our mistakes. Of course, Andrew Nicholas Murray said there are 3 kinds of people, you know. But I said there are 4. The few make things happen, the many who watch things happen, and the overwhelming majority who have no idea what has happened. And I'm saying there's a 4th class, those who have no idea and wish to have no idea what has happened there. And therefore, let us go forward. I am the quintessential optimist. I started with hope and institutional trust, and I close that way. You know what hope does to a society? What hope does to a living organism? It affirms. I sound like I evangelizing. No, I'm talking about hope right now. This bigger than PNM and UNC and partnership and MSJ and whatever else the next group will be called. Hope does something. Hope does something to the T lymphocyte. That's the manager of the immune system. And when you have hope in your prefrontal cortex, you know what happens there? It inspires the heartbeat. It does something else. It causes the swifter multiplication of the white blood cells, the alveolar macrophage controlled by the T and B lymphocytes. That's what hope does. You know what hope is all about, my dear? Hope is to the soul what oxygen is to the human body. And I'm hoping and I'm praying that all of us here would see. I know some government ministers say they don't see the need for it, but you know, we all live as we learn and we grow as we go. And I hope we see value in this. There's intrinsic value in this, and I support it. God bless you, and I thank you very much.
Senator Amin.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I just want to start by saying I appreciate the message of independent temporary Senator Pastor Dutton in terms of his message of hope. And this motion, the matter in this motion, with regards to Parliament and with regards to EBC, the Elections and Boundaries Commission is amongst those things that I believe firmly in. The same way I believe in Parliament, the same way I believe in protecting our institutions, the same way I believe in the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago and the fundamental human rights of every citizen. And I had intended to start my contribution with a line about optimism, and it just flows from the former speaker, the last speaker's contribution. Optimism is the faith that leads to achievement. And I thought about this the moment I heard the response from the government bench that sounded as though they did not have faith in going forward. It sounded to me from the contributors that we had thus far on the government bench that everything is okay the way it is. It sounded that they did not have any intention of growing and moving forward. And we as a nation, we have evolved since independence. We have evolved since the creation of our great constitution. And how far are we willing to take ourselves is something that we should ask ourselves. We sit in Parliament today based on our foundation of our nation, that is the past. But we are a connection to the future. And when I hear ministers of government, or in fact any parliamentarian, rejecting an opportunity for us as a nation to evolve, I am very concerned. And so I want to implore the members on the other side that if you take this motion in the spirit of nation building, if you take this motion in the spirit of it being an opportunity for us to leave something greater than we met, then you will be willing to join hands and work together as a parliament. On our last sitting, we debated a bill which was the product of a joint select committee comprising members of all benches, both houses. This was also a product of several governments working together. That is the Insurance Act. And I did not contribute in that debate because I felt that my colleagues had covered the matter sufficiently. But what struck me about that is the fact that it is possible for us, all of us, in government and in opposition, on different benches, to put our heads together and do something for the good of our nation. And this is one such opportunity. Madam President, given that the motion was brought by an opposition senator, it is very much the norm for the government to contribute against it. And from time to time, as opposition and government, that's what happens. And because Senator Mark, the mover of the motion, in his contribution, spoke about a possible mischief that could occur, I noticed that the government, almost immediately, from their responder, their response was going on the attack because it seems that something fell in their garden, if I could use that expression. So something might fall in your garden today, but tomorrow whose garden is it going to fall in? Madam President, in my contribution, which I hope to continue on the next day because I know I only have a few seconds remaining today, I intend to look at possible mischiefs and the responsibility that all of us have in making Trinidad and Tobago a better place, and the very noble intent of the purpose of Elections and Boundaries Commission to be protected for future generations. My presentation, I hope, will also add to our need for continued faith and optimism in Trinidad and Tobago as we continue to achieve from one milestone to another.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I beg to move that the Senate do now adjourn to Tuesday, the 29th of May, 2018, at 1:30 p.m. During that sitting, we will debate the motion on the DNA regulations.
Honourable Senators, before I put the question on the adjournment, leave has been granted for two matters. Well, look at this. It's so nice that there is such agreement. The nicest thing would have been if the presiding officer had been told, you know. Honourable Senators, before I move the adjournment, may I just remind all parliamentarians of the 10th gathering of Parliamericas, the Parliamentary Network for Gender Equality, which is focusing on gender-responsive climate action. And that is taking place over the period of May the 22nd to May the 24th. And I invite members to attend the sessions. They're interesting, they're relevant, and it will be good to see our local parliamentarians attend. Okay? So, Honourable Senators, the question is that this Senate do now adjourn to Tuesday, the 29th of May, 2018 at 1:30 p.m. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. This Senate now stands adjourned to Tuesday, the 29th of May, 2018 at 1:30 p.m.